Hi, my name is Kayla Ramsey, and I'm doing my Friday Fun Day presentation on hallucinogens. Now, let me start by saying that some of my sources are, I don't want to say questionable, but a little less scientifically sound, but they have the interesting information. Hallucinogens aren't very thoroughly researched, seeing as they're almost entirely illegal in Western cultures, so some of the descriptive accounts should be taken with a grain of salt. This information does, however, still serve as well to know. Anyway, to continue. Now that that's out of the way, what are hallucinogens? A hallucinogen is a drug that alters states of sensation and perception. These drugs have the ability to cause users to hallucinate, but they won't always. One shared experience among the various types of hallucinogens is that there are many subjective changes that occur. These are typically cognitive changes that will present in varied thoughts, emotions, and states of consciousness. There are three primary types of hallucinogens. These are psychedelics, dissociatives, and deliriants. And we'll get more into each of them in the coming slides. First, we'll start with psychedelics. There are a few different types of psychedelics, including ayahuasca, DMT, LSD, and psilocybin, which is also known as mushrooms, magic mushrooms, or shrooms. These drugs are all Schedule 1, meaning they're illegal under federal law and have no currently known therapeutic benefit. And on top of that, being Schedule 1 also means that there is risk involved. There's some sort of risk factor, whether that be risk of addiction or risk of harm, it is still a risk. Psychedelics have long been used in many cultures around the world and for many different reasons too. Many ancient cultures use psychedelics as a spiritual tool to allow them to allow them to access or reveal parts of their mind or soul that would not have been accessible normally. In fact, the word psychedelic actually comes from Greek roots, the first meaning mind or soul, second meaning manifest or reveal. Now, a major part of a trip, which is, what it's called when you're doing these, a major part of the trip is the emotional component. A lot of the experience is introspective, but that's not the fun part. That's usually when trips start getting bad. There are several records depicting psychedelic use in ancient cultures, a few of which I have listed here, but this isn't just some archaic ancient practice. In fact, many cultures still use these spiritual tools. For example, peyote can still be legally consumed in certain Native American tribes in the United States. Current laws regarding peyote in America are quite strange, actually. They depend on tribal membership in some states, and in other states, it's dependent upon reservation boundaries or religious intent. It's a little strange. But anyway, there's also the use of ayahuasca, which is a psychoactive drink made from vines, and it's used socially and ceremonially among indigenous tribes in the Amazon basin. Typically, this is made by a shaman. Each shaman will have their own version of this recipe, depending on their own traditions. And just a side note, if you've ever heard of the YouTube channel Vsauce, I have linked here an amazing video that they have. It's part of a series that they have called Mind Field. Season 2, episode 2 is about ayahuasca, and the host actually goes to the Amazon and he participates in an ayahuasca ritual, which is really interesting to watch. And it's all for science. So to continue on, psychedelics are unique in that they've been researched a bit more thoroughly since they have that possible therapeutic benefit. They've been a little more thoroughly researched. So we know with some certainty how psychedelics affect sensation and perception. For example, we know that they affect all of the senses, all 5 of the senses, but it can also include your sense of self and your sense of time. If your sense of self is affected, that could be perceived a few different ways. It could seem like the connections that you have with other people and other things just in your environment, just the world around you, those might feel stronger, making it seem like you're more connected. On the other hand, though, it could also feel like a literal alteration to your physical person. So I read one story where it said that someone felt that their hands were abnormally large, or they just didn't fully understand the physical boundaries of their own body. And if your sense of time is affected, time might seem slower or faster or not even relevant at all. Hours could pass entirely unnoticed. One unique feature of LSD specifically is that it reduces the functional connections that govern the cognitive processes, and it simultaneously increases sensory connectivity and connections made between different parts of the brain. So essentially, it's taking down all of these gates and it's opening your brain up to literal new ways of thinking, new connections to be made. And this is where we get concepts like synesthesia, which is a phenomenon that occurs when your senses overlap, essentially. For example, creating new connections between colors and sounds, which would allow you to visualize music. Okay, the next subclass of hallucinogens is dissociatives. This class includes ketamine, PCP, DXM, and nitrous oxide, and probably some others I missed. These drugs are very similar to psychedelics in that they do have the same legal status as well as similar effects to sensation and perception. The most notable difference, however, between psychedelics and dissociatives is that dissociative component. People who have consumed these drugs will depersonalize. They will have this feeling of being unreal or disconnected. While there is a chance for depersonalization when consuming psychedelics, it's almost expected from these drugs. This would likely be more dreamlike than psychedelics. Now, the last class of hallucinogens that I'm going to discuss is deliriants. Now, this was a class that I was almost entirely unfamiliar with, and I'll just say that it's a little scary, in my opinion. Common deliriants include nightshade and mandrake, as well as many other types of plants. But also Benadryl and Dramamine, both in very high doses, can act as deliriants. Or well, I guess I should say the active ingredient in those medications can. So shockingly, these are legal. This is something that you can get, and that is terrifying. And here is why. The effects of these drugs are much, much more intense than the others from what I could find, from people's stories, from the different science that I could find, everything like that. So while other hallucinogens don't always cause hallucinations, deliriants can reasonably be expected to produce hallucinations. They also cause delirium, of course, hence the name deliriants. And the hallucinations, not only will those be pretty much guaranteed, they're also going to be much more intense and much more realistic. And because of this, these deliriants are considered to be the true hallucinogen. The side effects of these drugs are also much more uncomfortable and typically are much more dangerous. Most of the other hallucinogens will typically cause feelings of euphoria or general well-being and overall elevation, just a general sense of positivity, but deliriants do not. Typically, these are going to have really intense feelings of fear, anxiety, and confusion. And because of this, there isn't much of a push to find any therapeutic value in these drugs, especially with the Benadryl and the Dramamine at those dosages, because of those negative side effects. We're not seeing as much push for research as we are with LSD or psilocybin. Now, here is why this is so frightening. The biggest distinction between this class and other classes of hallucinogens is their hallucinations. These are so much more intense and much more realistic than normal hallucinations. They've even created distinctions between two different types of hallucinations. There are external and internal hallucinations. External hallucinations are the ones that we typically think of. One that you hear a lot, or one that I read a lot, I guess, in all of my research, all of the accounts that I saw, people said that walls were melting. They saw the walls melt when they were taking whatever it was that they would take. Well, with deliriants, yeah, you might see the walls melt, or you might sit and talk to your childhood best friend for 3 hours, except that childhood best friend moved across the country when you were 12. It's much more intense and much more immersive. These hallucinations can take full forms and be fully autonomous, meaning they seemingly have full control over their own thoughts and actions. And the image on the right depicts external hallucinations caused by deliriants. Notice it's much more immersive. It's not just like a wall melting, like I said. On the other hand, though, we have internal hallucinations. This is something that you would see with your eyes closed, which sounds a little bit goofy when you say it, but it's also very realistic. It could be anything from like a small shape seeming to appear on the back of your eyelids when you close your eyes. This might only appear for a few seconds, or it might shift into another shape or another image, or it might disappear entirely. Those can be a little more transient. But just like external hallucinations, internal hallucinations can also be more evolved. A more evolved internal hallucination might be a fully interactive three-dimensional scene with an environment and people that you can interact with, but still only experience when you have your eyes closed.